Riley Kugel will not be a Rock Chalk Jayhawk next season after all, as the Florida transfer has re-entered the portal. What does it mean for Kansas, and what does it mean for Kugel?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, even throughout the offseason here. I want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners, and shout out to those of you who have joined us on our Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. It is very much appreciated. Reminder, you can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more right now. New customers will get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Folks, it is a Big 12 Thursday here on Locked On College Basketball. We're going to discuss Kansas losing Riley Kugel, who is not going to commit to the Jayhawks after all. We're going to talk about Arizona's recent transfer portal additions, whether it's enough to keep this team or to, push this team into the top 5 of the Big 12 in their first season. We're going to close out the show with a conversation with our guy, JT Wistrcill, the host of the Locked On Utes podcast. We're going to talk about a couple of pretty unique transfer portal additions for the Utah Utes to close out the show. But we start the lead here. Riley Kugel is no longer committed to join the Kansas Jayhawks next season. This was mentioned initially by Bill Self on Monday when he was speaking with the NCAA's Andy Katz. In an interview, he said that Riley Kugel's future with Kansas was, quote, up in the air. So that kind of sent off some alarm bells. People were like, what does this mean exactly? What's the situation there? Is Kugel still going to end up playing at Kansas? I don't think Bill Self would have said that if he felt like reasonably confident that Riley Kugel was going to stick with Kansas, because otherwise it's just raising alarm bells and kind of putting a story out there that ends up being a nothing burger if he does come to Kansas after all. But of course, he didn't. And now we have a situation where Riley Kugel is back in the transfer portal. We don't know a lot of the specifics of what happened here. There is certainly, it's easy to look at the fact that Kansas has added multiple other transfers who play a similar position to Riley Kugel since he committed to Kansas and make the obvious assumption, okay, Riley decided he doesn't want to go to Kansas after all because he doesn't have room he's not going to get as much playing time as he thought he was going to get because the team has added AJ Storr from Wisconsin, because the team added Zeke Mayo from South Dakota State, because the team added Rylan Griffen from Alabama. And that is a reasonable assumption to make. There's also the possibility that there's something else going on here, whether it's just a change of heart, something as simple as, hey, I've now been to Lawrence, or I've thought more about my decision, or whatever it may be. I would rather go back closer to home. He's from Florida. He's spent the last couple of years playing at Florida. Maybe there's a family situation. As of right now, as I'm recording this right now on Wednesday afternoon, we just don't know if there's more specifics to it. There's also been, I don't even really want to say rumblings, but it's possible that academics are playing a role here as well. This is something that I think is going to be a part of a lot of transfer portal situations in the future, with whether it's like the Michigan stories, which are obviously the ones that get the majority of the headlines when Michigan doesn't accept a Terrence Shannon or a Caleb Love or a John L. Davis. But increasingly, as players transfer more and more often, which is obviously happening in the transfer portal era, being able to commit to a different school and get in academically is going to be a challenge. It's going to be an issue, and it's more likely to be an issue with third and fourth year guys. Kugel's only been at Florida for 2 years, so in theory, the majority of his credits should transfer to Kansas, but I'm not working in that compliance office. Unless you are one of the few people on the planet who works at either Florida or Kansas as compliance office, we just don't know the situation and whether that is a factor or not, just to say that it could be a factor. Kugel last year averaged 9.2 points, 3.5 board, shot 31.5% from three, about 45% on two-pointers. He was a breakout candidate after a very strong freshman year for the Gators. Everybody, and I mean everybody, said, hey, Riley Kugel is going to break out for Florida as a sophomore. He's going to be a first-round pick in the 2024 NBA draft. That did not happen. He went from 9.9 points to 9.2 points. His other numbers all stayed about the same. The efficiency numbers dropped fairly considerably, about 5 percentage points on the three-point line, a little more than 5 percentage points on the two-point line. And he ended up just losing playing time throughout the year. Zion Poland took playing time from him. We saw, of course, Will Richard and Walter Clayton Jr. were the starting guards for Florida. And Kugel just kind of ended up not falling out of the rotation entirely, but certainly not taking on the role that many expected that he would. So then he enters the transfer portal and pretty quickly commits to Kansas. And everybody's thinking, okay, this is a nice addition for Bill Self. We'll see how he kind of fits in the mix. And then they go out and get Zeke Mayo. They go out and get AJ Storr from Wisconsin, quite possibly the biggest transfer portal name of the entire cycle. And then they go out and get Rylan Griffen from Alabama, who's going to fill a really valuable role for this Kansas team. And again, whether Kugel's decision to re-enter the portal has anything to do with academics or homesickness or playing time, it doesn't really matter, because it's a definitive fact that Riley Kugel's playing time was not going to be as much after those subsequent transfer portal additions as it looked like it was going to be when he first committed to Kansas. Because right now, looking at this Kansas team, they're still in pretty darn good shape. Hunter Dickinson returns, KJ Adams returns, DeJuan Harris returns. Nobody enters the transfer portal. They're one of very few Power 6 programs that did not have a single player enter the transfer portal this offseason. Again, we mentioned the guys coming back. We know Kevin McCullough is gone. We're pretty confident Johnny Furphy is gone, although in theory he could return to college as well. But even if we assume he does not, this is what the rotation looks like for Bill Self's team. Dickinson starts at the 5, Adams starts at the 4, AJ Storr starts at the 3, DeJuan Harris starts at the 1. That starting 2-guard spot is going to be either Zeke Mayo or Elmarko Jackson or Rylan Griffen. One of those 3 guys is going to step into that starting role. Elmarko Jackson did not do well in that starting role last season, but he could certainly take a leap developmentally from freshman year to sophomore year and compete with Griffen and Mayo for that starting spot. Whichever one of those guys starts, the other 2 will obviously be players 6 and 7 coming off the bench for Bill Self's team. They also have Flory Badinga, a 6'8" center. He's the 14th ranked player in the 2024 recruiting class. They also have Rakis Passmore, 6'5" shooting guard, who is the 44th ranked player in the 2024 class. That's a 9-man rotation right there. There are a handful of other players who were just outside of Kansas's rotation last year who have all committed, none of whom have entered the transfer portal, I should say. So they're all going to be in the mix as well. That's not to say Kugel wouldn't have played. They absolutely would have found a probably fairly significant role for him. It would have been at the expense probably of Passmore, potentially of some of the other guys on this roster. But ultimately, if you're a Kansas fan and you're pretty concerned about losing Riley Kugel, it's never great. You never want to see this happen, but this is a team that's in pretty good shape. Like I've said on the show a few times that I take Kansas's top 9 and put them up against just about anybody in college basketball. This knocks them a bit. It knocks them a bit, but honestly, not that much. This is still a really fantastic roster, and assuming Bill Self can find ways to put all these pieces together, this is going to work out just fine for the Jayhawks. As for what it means for Kugel, it's too early to know. We haven't seen any obvious, like a list on Twitter of like, hey, here are the 5 schools that have reached out to Riley Kugel since he re-entered the portal, or here's who he's visiting, or what. We haven't seen any of that yet. Obviously, as we get more information about that, we will discuss it more on the show. I suspect he's going to be a hot commodity. He was somebody who wasn't really available in the portal for very long, so I don't know how many contacts he made initially. But now with so many of the top guards already off the board, including the recent additions the recent departures of Kadari Richmond and Davon Smith, who are both now with St. John's, there's not a lot of top-tier guards available in the portal. Riley Kugel becomes instantly one of the premier players available. So I suspect that programs like Baylor or even UConn or Duke, they may get involved here. I don't know how great of a fit Kugel is at those schools individually, but I think that the programs that are guard needy right now, they're going to give Riley Kugel a call if they haven't already by the time you're listening to this, because the upside is there. The performance was not great last year, but the upside is still absolutely there. And I think he's going to generate quite a bit of interest this second time around in the transfer portal. Well, folks, most of the attention that has been on Arizona and the Wildcats this offseason has been about the team's losses in the transfer portal, but Tommy Lloyd made some big additions recently as well as they look to jump right back into the top of the Big 12 standings. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But after I tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. For many years, I had my own financial spreadsheet where I used it to try to track all of my various finances. It was so much time, so much effort, so much energy and frustration just trying to keep up with it all. And I remember wishing that someone could just do it for me. And then I was told by my financial advisor that he does everything I was trying to do just by simply plugging it all into Yahoo Finance. I gave it a go and loved it, and I have been all in ever since. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just looking for some extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart other great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look into your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million monthly users, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. So for comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination. That's yahoofinance.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And we're staying in the Big 12 today for all three segments. Of course, nowadays a Big 12 show can be Kansas, Arizona, and Utah, which is the three schools we're talking about today. Still not getting used to that being the case, but here we are looking at Arizona and their recent addition of Campbell transfer guard Anthony Dell'Orso. This is a big-time addition and a player that I don't think got a lot of attention during this portal season, a player who I think is not really generating the kind of buzz that perhaps he should be based on the performance that he had last year for the Campbell Camels. He's a 6'6" Australian guard. He spent the last 2 years at Campbell, and last season, Dell'Orso averaged 19.5 points per game, 6.5 boards, 2 assists, 1.6 steals. He was very efficient, 53.7% on two-pointers, even 38% from three. That was on about 4 attempts per game, and he shot 81% from the free throw line. Dell'Orso committed to Arizona over a list of a significant amount of schools, which included TCU, Virginia, Xavier, and Providence. Dell'Orso is also in the NBA draft process, although he is widely expected to return, barring some kind of incredibly insane workout schedules that he does with various teams. If that were to happen and he started getting guarantees, certainly that would change the equation. But the general consensus is overwhelmingly that he is expected to return to Arizona. And why wouldn't you? Tommy Lloyd runs an NBA-style offense. Your ability to get eyes and attention from scouts goes up infinitely switching from Campbell to Arizona. Now, especially with Arizona in the Big 12, I mean, the jump from the CAA to the Big 12 is one of the biggest jumps that you can make in Division I college basketball. And it's going to be fascinating to see how Dell'Orso handles that jump. But it's in terms of bumping up his NBA draft profile, this is the way that you do that. You go to a program like Arizona where you're going to get eyes on you. You're going to play the top tier competition in college basketball, and you're going to play in an offensive set that I think scouts are going to want to see how you handle in that situation. This is a big move for Lloyd because it helps replace some of the significant amount of losses that we have seen from the Wildcats so far this offseason. Pelle Larsson, their starting three, the player that Dell'Orso is likely going to replace in terms of minutes and production and performance, Pelle Larsson's gone. He's in the NBA draft process. Keshad Johnson, their starting power forward, the San Diego State transfer, he's in the NBA draft process as well. Meanwhile, Kylan Boswell has already transferred to Illinois. Starting center Umar Ballo decided to play his final year of college basketball at Indiana instead of at Arizona. So those four guys are all gone. Meanwhile, KJ Lewis and Caleb Love are both in the NBA draft process right now, although both are expected at this point to return. We'll see if that happens. Obviously, if both players choose not to return, that's a really significant loss for Tommy Lloyd and his backcourt. But even if those two guys do come back, you're still losing four key starters in Larsson, Johnson, Boswell, and Ballo. All of those guys are out the door. They also lost a trio of depth options who have pursued other options in the transfer portal as well. That includes Paulos Morauskas, who went to St. Mary's, Philip Borvisanin, who went to New Mexico, and then Dylan Anderson, who has transferred to Boise State. This is going to be a brand new look team for Tommy Lloyd and the Arizona Wildcats next year. Tough to have to rebuild a roster when you go from the Pac-12 to the Big 12, where you're going to have a lot of competition, where every single game is going to be an absolute dogfight, grind it out type of contest. However, Dell'Orso is not the only addition that Arizona has made so far this transfer portal season. We've talked briefly at times, usually kind of shoving it into a six-pack, about some of the other players that Tommy Lloyd and Arizona have brought in. But right now, I want to take a fuller scope look at what this offseason has been like so far for Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats, because we talked about the losses and we talked about the most recent addition, which is Anthony Dell'Orso from Campbell. But this team also brought in a 6'8" power forward from Tennessee, Tobe Awaka, who did not have a super productive season in terms of raw numbers at Tennessee. Part of that is just the players who were in front of him on the roster. Part of that is just the fact that Tennessee is a very defensive-focused team, and they don't necessarily light up the scoreboard the way that somebody like Arizona does, for example. But Awaka did average 5 points, 4.5 boards, and he was very efficient, just over 59% from the field. He's not a floor spacer. He does all of his scoring around the rim, but in terms of just adding some physicality, some size, a bit of an enforcer on the block, again, you lose Keshad Johnson and Umar Ballo, so you need some more physical presence in the front court, and Tobe Awaka, coming from that Tennessee system that Rick Barnes runs, is going to be able to add that for Tommy Lloyd's team. They also went out and got Trey Townsend from Oakland, a player who made a name for himself with a really strong performance for Oakland in the NCAA tournament. He was fantastic for them in the regular season as well. He joins Arizona, 6'6" forward. He's got 1 year of eligibility remaining, a player that many think could put himself in the NBA draft conversation with a strong season at Arizona as well. He's, again, a 6'6" forward, so the same size as Dell'Orso, averaged 17.3 points, 8.1 rebounds, 3.1 assists, and 1.3 steals last year for Oakland. Shot 46% on two-pointers and 37.5% from the three-point line. So you got your three transfer portal additions, Tobe Awaka, Trey Townsend, and Anthony Dell'Orso. You have a lot of losses, but another important detail for Arizona, they got a really good recruiting class coming in. And I think that's where you see the depth options, the Dylan Andersons and the Morauskases. That's why you see those guys transferring, because they're looking at the incoming recruiting class and they're thinking, man, I was hoping that all these players leaving would lead to me getting more playing time, but I'm probably just going to get replaced by an incoming freshman. And in some cases, they're probably right. And that's why it makes sense to transfer to somewhere like New Mexico or Boise State or St. Mary's, because this class coming in, very solid. We got Josan Sanan he's a 6'5", 4-star small forward. He's ranked 22nd in the class. This is all using 24/7 Sports' rankings. They also have Carter Bryant, who's been on the radar for a very long time, an explosive athlete, extreme athlete, like the kind of guy who could win a dunk contest in the not too distant future. He's a 6'8", 4-star small forward. He's ranked 26th in the 2024 recruiting class. They also have Jamari Phillips, a 6'3", 4-star combo guard. He's 52nd in the recruiting class. And then Emmanuel Steven, a 7-footer, another 4-star. He's a center, and he is 104th in the class. So 4 freshmen coming in, 3 transfers coming in, a lot of players exiting. What does that mean on May 8th as we try to look at what the Big 12 standings are going to look like? And the question is whether Arizona can be a top 5 team in the Big 12. And it's kind of crazy that it feels like the ceiling for Arizona is a top 5 team in their conference. This is a team that was a 2 seed in back-to-back seasons. You rarely talk about 2 seeds as teams that are barely or maybe going to finish top 5 in their conference. But here's the deal. Kansas, Baylor, Houston, and Iowa State. All 4 of those teams right now look like top 10 teams in the country. We talked about Kansas obviously losing Riley Kugel, but they are still unquestionably not just a top 10 team, but right now a top 5 team in the country next year. I think Iowa State is in that conversation as well. They retained basically everybody from a team that was extremely good last year. They've made some quality additions, including Joshua Jefferson from St. Mary's. Baylor's still got a little bit of work to do, but I think they're in a much better spot right now. Norchad O'Meara and Jeremy Roach is a tremendous transfer portal class. You figure out, you throw in VJ Edgecombe, the star freshman who's joining that team. They've had a lot of success with one and done freshmen the last couple of years. That's a really, really good team as well. And Houston, yeah, they keep LJ Cryer. They lose Jamal Shedd. They lose some other players as well. But Terrence Arsenault's coming back from injury. Emmanuel Sharp's going to be back. That Houston team is going to be really good as well. The question is whether Arizona can be, are we going to be talking about the Big 12's Big Four or the Big 12's Big Five? Is Arizona going to be in that conversation? Because there are some other teams that can compete for that spot as well. Cincinnati returns almost everybody from a team that was very good last year. Texas Tech, we'll see what Grant McCasland can do. They got some roster churn going on, but that team was quality last year. Kansas State, Jerome Tang has made some big moves already. They get Doug McDaniel from Michigan. They got some other transfers coming in. They did just lose Arthur Kaluma, which is going to hurt them a little bit. BYU, we'll see where they're at. They obviously have a significant amount of turnover with a new coach, Kevin Young, coming in, but they've brought in some pieces as well. And that's not even everybody. Obviously, we'll see what West Virginia looks like with the new head coach, Darian DeVries. You got the rest of the newcomers joining the conference along with Arizona and Arizona State, in Colorado and Utah. We're going to talk about Utah momentarily. This is going to be a tough conference. It always is. It always is. TCU didn't even mention them. They were a tournament team last year, very quality program as well. So I think Arizona is in that top five. And I think that's kind of the cutoff, is those are your top five teams. But this is a program with a lot of rebuilding still to be done. If you're a believer in Tommy Lloyd and his ability to get the best out of his players and make the pieces work, then I think you feel pretty good about the players that Arizona has brought in so far. But they're not going to have those gimme games that they've had in the Pac-12. Every single game is going to be a gauntlet in the Big 12. And I'm excited and curious and cautiously optimistic about what Arizona is going to look like in their first year in a new conference with a very new look roster. Well, folks, Utah added a pair of transfers from Baylor this week, but one of them is going to be lining up on the gridiron instead of the hardwood. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, it is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now new customers will get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And right now, if you're looking ahead of the 2025 NCAA tournament, Kansas remains the favorite to win it all at FanDuel. They are at plus 1,000 odds. Meanwhile, Arizona, not as good at odds. They're at plus 3,500. But if you're a believer, if you're a big Trey Townsend fan or a big Anthony Dell'Orso fan, you're thinking, hey, this team's going to turn it around, and that extra competition in the Big 12 is going to put them in a spot where they can kind of exercise those NCAA tournament demons, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I'm thrilled to be joined to close out today's show by JT Wistrcill, the host of the Locked On Utes podcast. Like I said, we're keeping it in the Big 12. It's weird that the three schools we're talking about on today's show are Kansas, Arizona, and Utah, but they are all technically Big 12 teams, and that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk about some of the roster movement we've recently seen for the Utes. And JT, I want to start with the Caleb Lohner transfer, because for me, I read the tweet before I saw the picture. And I saw that Caleb Lohner, of course, he spent 2 years at BYU, 7 points, 7 rebounds per game player, went to Baylor, spent a couple years there as a reserve forward, didn't play much. I see that he's entering the transfer portal. I see that he's committing to Utah. And I think, okay, that's some nice depth. You know, they lost Brandon Carlson. They need some more depth in the front court. This will be great. And then I scrolled down and I was like, he is wearing a football uniform. And I realized, of course, that he is actually transferring to Utah to join the football team. And he mentioned in his tweet that he may play for the basketball team. It was sort of this vague, open-ended statement. And interestingly, Baylor has had multiple players transition from football to basketball. I don't know why it happens at Baylor a lot. In fact, most of you who listen to this know that I also host Locked On Zags. Dimitri Goodson played at Gonzaga as a point guard, transferred to Baylor, played cornerback, and ended up playing in the NFL. They had Mark Vital do the similar situation, played basketball, transitioned to football. I don't know why it's happening at Baylor constantly, but I want to talk to you about what this means for Utah, specifically for football and a little bit for basketball, because it's just kind of a goofy announcement that we got earlier this week.
It's very goofy. By the way, you mentioned Mark. Did he work with the Chiefs? Did that end up working out for him?
I think so. The last update I saw, yeah.
Okay, good for him. Also, please don't remind us Utah fans right now that we are in the same basketball conference as Kansas and Arizona, because we got enough things we're stressing about. Hence why I'm on this show right now. But great to be on with you, Andy. The Caleb Lohner situation is wild. I remember being a student at Utah while he was being recruited. Bumped into him on campus while he was on his official visit. And you're like, everyone was all really excited about the potential of Caleb Lohner, a guy who went to Wasatch Academy, which is obviously a big school out there where they develop basketball talent. Another guy we might talk about in Keita also went there. But yeah, it was really disappointing when he goes to BYU, has some success there. Never really lived, and same thing at Baylor, right? Like contributed, but never really lived up to the 4-star billing that he received. And I think that's why we're seeing him try to go play football, because I don't think he sees an NBA path, because there isn't an NBA path with his game and the way it's played at the next level. And it's going to be very hard for there to be an NFL path with him. But I'll say this. He is 6'8" and 235. There are only so many NFL players who can claim to be 6'8", and we've seen before tight ends and we've seen before some of these guys who play basketball, like also then they transition to be tight ends, which is reportedly what he would be doing. He was seen at the spring game talking to Utah's tight end coach, and I think that makes some sense just because of the size, the jumping ability. You see the potential there. I will say, Andy, Utah's one of the best tight end rooms in the country. They got a guy in Brant Kuithe who has 2 600-yard receiving seasons. They got 2 other quality starters. I don't see a path for him to play much this fall, but maybe it's get the start, get the potential, and then try for the NFL thing. But no, Utah basketball absolutely needs Caleb Lohner. So he is definitely welcome on the basketball team. Craig Smith and co have missed out on a few recruits now, especially guys like Brandon Carlson moving on, Keita we already mentioned. Lohner will definitely come in right away, and I think he'd be a backup center kind of right now is what they would look at him most for too. But a great get for the basketball team. And you know what? When you're in Utah football, who's been consistently a top 15 program, over the past few seasons, that's where you're kind of sitting okay, you can afford to take a low risk, high reward type of guy. And for the basketball player, it's kind of a necessity for the men's basketball team right now.
Yeah, the men's basketball team in particular, there are a lot of losses in the front court, like we mentioned with Carlson and a couple other guys, and some losses in the backcourt recently as well. We got Raleigh Worcester going over to Nebraska. Devin Smith heads out; he's transferring to St. John's. We mentioned Keita. He's going to transfer to BYU. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But there are some additions coming in. Craig Smith did bring in some guys. And speaking of Baylor, obviously Caleb Lohner is looking like he's going to be football and basketball. But Miro Little is going to be a basketball player for the Utah Utes. He's going to play the point guard position. He's a guy who was not relatively seldom used at Baylor, but probably a guy who's going to step into a bigger role again with the losses we've already seen. You got Boston College point guard Mason Madsen coming in. You got a couple other bigs coming in, Keanu Dawes, from Rice, as well as Zach Keller from Wake Forest. And it feels like there's still a lot of roster construction to be done for Craig Smith and the Utes. And like you mentioned, some guys they struck out on, but we're seeing the pieces starting to come together for this roster. Any of those transfers in particular kind of stand out to you of hey, this is a guy we're really excited about bringing into the Utes program?
To me, it's Little by far.
Yeah.
Madsen excites me. He's the twin brother of Gabe. I think there's some fun. Gabe Madsen is Utah's best returning player by a country mile currently right now. He's a decent shooter, but he only averaged 8 points a game. You lost Davion Smith. You lost Raleigh Worcester. Brandon Carlson's leaving. So much of this team's scoring has departed. That's where it's man, we really need to get more scoring in there. So Madsen helps, and even though Little only averaged a point a game, I'm excited and optimistic about what he can do at Utah, because this is a guy who was a former 4-star. He has a lot of potential, was buried behind a backcourt that helped lead Baylor into the NCAA tournament. Utah was not an NCAA tournament team. There's a reason this is the first time I'm on this show, and I'm sure Utah basketball only came up so many times on that show because there's already enough teams to talk about in the field of 68 that you're only going to go so far until you get to the Utahs of the world. So they still got a lot of work to do and try to get there. And if you're a team like Utah who was on the last 12, let's say, that missed out, you're looking for adding guys that are kind of those guys. Okay, who's being overlooked right now? And Little has the potential to be that, despite not having a ton of success at Baylor. potential is so big in college basketball, obviously. Yeah. And it's undeniable that Little has that. He's a guy who's played for the Finnish national team, right? And during his time in the 2023 FIBA World Cup, averaged 5 points a game, 4.6 assists in 17 minutes, right? Came over now, had to adjust to the college game and everything that comes along with there. But I think it was a great learning experience for him at Baylor. He still played in a lot of games for them, despite not receiving a ton of minutes. And I think we see guys oftentimes make their best leaps from their freshman to sophomore year. And I think in a lot of ways, he has an opportunity to take the reins of the starting point guard spot with both Rooster and Davon Smith also being gone. So this is where I see an opportunity for Little to potentially be really good. Even though he only averaged a point a game, I'm really excited about his potential because I think that it could be really high. And if Utah is going to be successful in the Big 12, I just have a hard time seeing a world in which they are successful and Little's not a key part of it.
Let's talk about that move to the Big 12 because I think we're looking at two programs in particular who are coming over in Utah and Colorado who probably had a better would have been more enjoyable for the fan base if they had joined the previous year when Brandon Carlson was in the mix for Colorado. They're losing a lot of significant talent as well. And now you come into the conference and obviously it's a move predicated based on football. The majority of conference realignment moves are, and Utah obviously has had quite a bit of success in the football area, but from a basketball perspective, this is going to be tough. I don't think there's really any other way to look at it because on one hand, obviously going into the Big 12, you're going to probably be able to get better recruits. You're going to be able to sell recruits on, hey, you're coming to the best basketball conference. Even if we finish 500 in conference play, you finished 500 in the Pac-12, you had no chance of making the NCAA tournament. You finish 500 in the Big 12, you're probably going to go dancing. So I do think there are some pros that come with it, but at the same time, looking at what this conference is going to look like next year, it's a tough path right now for this Utah team to be. And I mean, we again, in the second segment of this show, we talked about Arizona, like they're going to have to fight hard to be a top 5 team in the conference. They've been a 2 seed 2 years in a row, and they may not be a top 5 team in their own conference. That is how crazy deep the Big 12 is and top heavy and all the way throughout. And for Utah, like for Coach Craig Smith, like he's going to have his hands full trying to find ways to compete in basketball games this year.
He is, and his job could potentially be on the line. There are tons of fans that are calling for his job. I think Craig Smith is a good coach.
Yeah,
there's no question that we've missed on some recruits there. You've lost some huge road games. Now, nearly making the NCAA tournament and then going far in the NIT was a step in the right direction. I definitely think he's earned another year to do things like that. But if you regress simply because you're in as tough a conference as the Big 12 and you've lost out on a lot of talent, I'll also say the best guy over the course of Craig Smith's tenure at Utah was Brandon Carlson. Yep. That's not a guy he brought in. That was a Larry Krystkowiak holdover. So I do think this will be his opportunity where, yes, you got Davon Smith last year. That was a great get. You got to do it again. And that's what college basketball has become, right? No one knows that better than you and all of your listeners, how big the transfer portal is. You got to continue to add and bring in talent, but it's going to be tough. And sometimes in order to get your basketball program back to where you hope it can be when you're making the NCAA tournament every year or just frequently, you got to get your teeth kicked in and you got to really go down and then you kind of have to rebuild it from there. So it's going to be a great, interesting path to see how it goes for Utah basketball. I think it's going to be rough in year one, but I'm excited to get BYU and Utah back twice a year. I think that aspect of the rivalry renewed is going to be a lot of fun, especially with the added drama of assistant coach Chris Burgess, who started at BYU. Then he went to Utah. Now he's back at BYU. And in the last hour of the transfer portal, he took Keba Keita with him to go to BYU now. So a lot of fun drama there. I'm excited to have the rivalry back. I think it's going to be one of the better ones in the Big 12 in general. BYU basketball, even with Kevin Young, they got a good chance to be better than Utah still, even in their first year. But rivalry games are always fun. And I think long-term, this move, getting Utah into a tougher conference, will force them to elevate their level. And I do eventually think we will see Utah make some NCAA tournaments in the Big 12. It's not going to be a year in and year out type of thing, but I just think when you're playing against teams this good, it forces you to raise your level. And that's what Utah has to do.
JT Wistrcill, Locked On Utes, thank you so much for coming on the show. Like we said, first time, but hopefully not the last time. Hopefully there's more excitement with Utah basketball to come, and we can have more conversations like this. Why don't you let the folks know where they can find you, where they can find the podcast?
Yeah, you guys can check me out on Twitter. Our show is at Locked On Utes. Mine is at JT Wistrcill, listed below as well. But yeah, Locked On Utes. We're talking all things Utah football. We're very excited about football. Football should be very good this year. A lot of returners coming back. Basketball, absolutely no idea. I'm actually going to be doing an episode that comes out this week talking about where the basketball program's kind of at right now. So if you guys have any interest in that too, it's going to be a fascinating offseason to cover Utah basketball. So we'll continue to do that on the show too. Andy, thank you so much for having me on, man. It's great talking to you.
It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Myself and co-host Isaac Shade will be back on Friday, getting you ready for the weekend and getting everything going with the transfer portal madness as it continues. Thanks for listening. And until next time, as always, peace out.